Okay, during this week's lecture, we're going to be looking at the vineyard, and specifically, since this isn't a viticulture course, it's a winemaking course, we're going to be looking at it from the eyes of a winemaker who wants to know more about the vineyard, the function of the vineyard, and maybe some of the ways that vineyard people look at the vineyard as a way to make it easier to speak with the vineyard people. So this is kind of our goal or a task for the week, we'll say, is just to see how deep we can get into vineyard work. Now, I know that some of you have extensive vineyard experience. Some of you probably have no vineyard experience. And so for those of you who do, bear with us and feel free to add any of your insights and experience that you want to. And for those of you who are new to this, hopefully this will give you a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of basis on which to understand where grapes come from, and I think more importantly, where grape flavor comes from, because ultimately that's what it's all about. So let's keep going here, and we'll see what we come up with. Now, I have a statement here, and some people will take exception to it, but basically, it is that fine wine is made in the vineyard. And we hear this, and sometimes we don't really know what it means. So I want to give a little bit of explanation for that because I find it to be true, at least in part. And so there's some premises that we're going to go under here. And you can see then how this statement has some truth in it and is a good guiding light, or a way to at least think about this so that it kind of makes sense in the future. So the first thing is that grape flavors originate during ripening. A quick illustration of this: if you take a peach, the first peaches that come out in the season in the supermarket, you pick one up that looks kind of nice. It's big, it's full, it's got the right colors. You notice it's hard, and you smell it. It doesn't smell like anything. And you taste it, and it doesn't taste like anything. Why? It's not ripe. Okay? Grapes are the same way. When the peach ripens, it tastes really good. It's juicy, it's sweet, it's got lots of flavor. When grapes ripen, they get juicy, they get sweet, they get lots of flavor. That makes good wine. So grape flavors, then, it's important that they be allowed to develop in the vineyard. And in fact, ripening is one of the tantamount things that has to happen, and something that we all strive for when working in the vineyard. Okay, so continuing on then, vineyard practices affect how these flavors develop. So basically, what makes fruit ripen? Well, exposure to sunlight and heat and appropriate amounts of water. And you really don't need much more than that if everything's still on the vine. So vineyard practices then are pretty much all oriented toward exposure to sunlight, adequate water, and in some way that exposure to sunlight also has to do with leaves and photosynthesis, and so you've got to have the right number of leaves for the amount of fruit, and that all has to be tied in together so that there's not too much fruit given the amount of energy, nutrients and water that's available to the vine. So in other words, there's a sense of balance that comes in. So the vineyard person then is really oriented toward creating just the perfect balance so that everything comes together and the flavors develop from the ripeness. That's where it all starts. One of the other important things to realize is that winemakers cannot, well, let me say, should not try to replace flavor that's not present. Yes, they can add artificial flavor, and it will taste like wine with artificial flavor added. So don't do it. So if the flavor isn't there from ripening, then the winemaker doesn't stand a chance of getting the flavor in there. And further, if there is unripe or rotten fruit flavors, they will carry over into the wine, and you'll have an unripe, rotten, fruit-flavored wine. So therefore, this comes back to this axiom that fine wine is made in the vineyard. And why? Because that's where flavor develops. Now, there will be those who argue, no, fine wine is not made in the vineyard. Good grapes are made in the vineyard. Fine wine is made from those good grapes. And that I would agree with also, because it takes a skillful winemaker to realize the full potential of the fruit that comes from that vineyard. So if you don't have good grapes, you're not going to make good wine. If you don't have a good winemaker, your chances of making good wine goes downhill. So fine wine is made in the vineyard to the extent that the necessary potential is there, and it's up to the winemaker to realize that potential and actually make the fine wine. All right, so what does the grower have to work with then? Well, we've got weather, and certainly the grower has to work with that, doesn't have much choice. There's the soil. Again, the grower really has to work with that. There's not much choice. There's some things they can do, but not a whole lot. Geography, again, it's kind of given. You know, you can go in and change the shape of the land to a degree, but it doesn't, ultimately it's not going to be the answer. And the one thing the grower can work with is the grape variety. And so we can find, you know, in certain areas this is specified. In other words, certain regions of the world you have to grow certain varieties, Pinot Noir in Burgundy, for example. Otherwise, it's up to the grower to find the best variety for the site and for the conditions. Ultimately, the grower, let me back up here. And so these 4 things that I have listed here are part of what we refer to as terroir. If you've been around the wine community for very long, you'll understand or realize very quickly that terroir is a buzzword. It doesn't come without controversy. There are those who swear by it and those who swear when they hear it because they don't believe it. It's up to you whether or not you feel that terroir actually does have merit, and personally I think it does. I'm not sure that we know all the answers. In fact, I know we know not all of the answers in terms of what terroir is and what affects flavor. You know, to give you an example, the recent literature coming out has been that there's actually the bacterial population has a lot of influence on the flavor of the grapes, on this concept of terroir. So now they're saying, well, if we can just transplant bacteria from Burgundy to Northern California, we'll make absolutely fantastic, fine Burgundian style Pinot Noir. The problem there is that the weather is very different, the soil is very different, the geography is very different. The grape variety is the only thing that's the same, and if they put the bacteria in the ground, they'll probably reach their own population and it won't be the same anyway, so it ain't going to happen that way. Instead, the grower has a set of variables and it's up to them to make the best of it. So ultimately, what they're really looking at doing is achieving a balance between the crop load. So if you look at the vineyard picture there on the right, you can see a line of fruit right down through here. And this is the fruiting zone of the trellis, and above it is the canopy. And basically what the grower is trying to do is make a balance between the amount of fruit here and the amount of leaf area here that can catch sunlight up above. In other words, crop load versus the ability to capture energy. And it's very site specific, so where you are, and also variety specific. Certain varieties produce more canopy and have a different growth habit, and so they all have to take that into effect. And we'll look at some of that as we go along here. But first, let's look at some very basic grape growing requirements. And this is, I would say, applicable to the Vitis genus of plants, which includes Vitis vinifera, Vitis labrusca, all kinds of different Vitis grapes, and these are kind of grapes as we know them. Now, there's some specific conditions. They need a temperate climate. So Pennsylvania is in a temperate climate. And an easy way to think of a temperate climate is 4 seasons. All right, so we have summer, we have spring, we have winter, and we have fall. And every year we go through a cycle of these 4. We get cold in the winter, we get warm in the summer. Spring is the time it warms up, fall is the time it cools down, and it just continues in that way. We also have rain that falls on our heads, and sometimes we think it's too wet, but ultimately for grapes it can't be too wet or too humid, nor can it be too dry, although they prefer it dry more so than warm or wet. It also has to have a fairly well-defined temperature range, and typically speaking, 0 degrees would be the minimum. We sometimes get lower than that in certain parts of the state, and the maximum is 95, and we certainly get above that in parts of the state at certain times as well. So we can go outside of that range in a certain way. However, if we do it too much or too often, then we can run into problems, especially if we go below 0. Grapes also like sunlight, and I would say in some ways that is one of our limiting factors, at least in the Lake Erie region where I'm at. We can have nice temperatures. Because of the lake, we seldom get above 95. And when we have cold weather, the lake tempers us usually, and so we stay above 0 or dip just below it, and so that we have protection from that. What we don't have is sunlight, and that's the hard part because we can't replace that. Can't really do much about it. But these are kind of the requirements. And what's really interesting is we can identify the temperate climate zone in the world on the globe. And then we can look at where the wine regions are, and we'll see that they line up pretty well. So here we have the globe, and there's two bands. There's one in the northern hemisphere, and there's one in the southern hemisphere that is the temperate zone. And I've kind of stuck push pins in on this map to indicate where the different zones are, or the different grape growing regions are in the world, kind of the major ones. And going across the top, we can see here's Washington State, California. I think that's Virginia, Pennsylvania maybe. Over here we have Portugal and Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Austria, and also we get over into Turkey and some of the other areas in this area, so Georgia and Turkey. What's interesting to note is that when we get into Asia, we don't find it. At least we haven't until recently. This, I would say, is cultural. The Asians don't have the same culture that we do in terms of wine, and so we don't find many wine-growing regions that have the history, anyway, that we do outside of Asia. That's changing, of course, and we're seeing a lot of wines being made and grown in parts of China. So that will probably become a region to watch at some point, or at least one of the regions there. But for the moment, it's kind of a void. If we go to the southern hemisphere, less land mass, but also again, if you look right through this band, we've got the two South American regions, South African, Australia, and also New Zealand. So basically, wherever there's land in the southern hemisphere, you're going to find some of these wine-growing areas. So this is kind of the effect of climate then on grape growing and where it kind of has to happen. Now, within these temperate zones, of course, there are regions that are not, it's not possible to grow grapes. So, for example, there are parts of North America where it is just too cold. We'll say for most grapes. There actually are vineyards in all 50 states now, with the exception of Alaska. And some of them are more or less successful, we'll say, but they do exist. And of course, in parts of Europe, there are some areas where they don't have grapes in that temperate zone. But let's keep going on here, and let's look at maybe some more specific things. And so, when we talk about grape growing areas, we can divide it into different like climate zones. And we start large and work our way small. So macroclimate, in other words, the largest subclimate area, we'll say, is representative of a grape growing region. And we'll look at least a couple of them and kind of see how this works out in terms of how you can have a region within this broad climate that actually is probably better or at least sustains grapes. Then when you get into the next level down, we're talking mesoclimate, and this is a vineyard site. So next to each other, you can have several vineyards, and each one might be functioning just a little bit different in terms of what it can produce and the quality that it produces. So this vineyard site, this vineyard location is important, and I would say this is incredibly important in Pennsylvania and kind of the East Coast. And the reason is that we're kind of pushing the limits for a lot of the varieties that we're growing. And usually it shows up in terms of, well, two things. One would be cold resistance, and the other would be ripening, so that kind of the exposure to sun. And so the presence of a hillside or a slope oftentimes has a big effect on this. And basically what we're talking about is sun angle. And this is kind of a fun thing to do. What I'm talking about here is that as you orient a slope toward the sun, you actually pick up more heat from the sun. And if you don't believe me, winter's a good time of the year to do this. And if the sun's shining, all you have to do is go outside, and you can take your gloves off and hold your hand kind of just parallel to the earth, so kind of flat. You can do palm side down. I like to do palm side down because the back of my hand's fairly sensitive. And notice how the sun feels on the back of your hand. And then, in the wintertime, the sun's usually at a fairly low angle. Do this in the morning if nothing else. And then just kind of turn your hand, the back of your hand, so that it faces toward the sun. And you should notice that it gets a little warmer. So take this same concept and apply it to land. If you have a hillside that faces the sun, it picks up more heat. More heat allows better ripening. Better ripening gives better flavor makes better wine. So this is one of the principles behind vineyard location is find a site that's oriented toward the sun. So a southern facing slope. Sometimes they'll go east facing or west facing so that they get the morning sun or the evening sun, but ultimately, capitalize on the sun exposure that way. Slopes also allow air drainage. As air cools, it gets dense, and so it begins to flow much like water, and it will run downhill. So cold air slides off the hill, which means toward the top of the hill, you actually will be warmer than toward the bottom where this cold air kind of forms a pool. So a slope allows the cold air to drain away and keeps you from maybe reaching those temperatures which would kill the vines. Less important for us, although not something that we can't just ignore, is water drainage. And this probably plays more into soil than it does slope, but slope is part of this. In other words, we want the water to drain away and not stand around, because grapes, well, they don't like to have wet feet. So they want good drainage. The other thing about a vineyard site is its proximity, and this also applies to the regional, the macroclimate, is proximity to a body of water. And we'll see an example of how this plays out in the big time. But basically, water retains heat, or it can actually cool things off depending on where you're located. In the East Coast, we like to have the heat, and most of the northern growing regions need water for heat. And we'll see, like in Germany, for example, just about every major growing region is next to a river. And because the heat of the river helps keep the temperatures at safe and sustainable places. If you go elsewhere, like California or Australia, you find that the best growing regions actually receive cooling breezes off the body of water, and that is what keeps things cool enough to grow the grapes. So it tempers the temperatures for us and provides the proper conditions for grape growing. And then finally, we get down to the last climatic zone, and this one is kind of interesting. It's the microclimate. So micro means really small. And what we're talking about here is the vine. And in one sense, the vine, as the smallest one, has its own climate within what we call the canopy. So the canopy is that grouping of leaves. And this is where the vineyardist comes into play, because, well, they can go out and affect that canopy management as part of their their job in terms of managing the vine just overall, so the growth of the vine. How does this work? Well, here's something to think about. If it's a hot day and the sun is shining and you're outside working, at some point you take a break, and where do you go? You go sit under a tree where it's cooler because of the shade of the vine or the canopy of the tree. Or you're walking across a hot field in the summertime and you walk into the woods and it's nice and cool. This is the experience of a microclimate, going from one area into somewhere that has leafy plants, and it cools down a little bit. So we can kind of use the canopy to adjust that. You might also notice when you walk in the woods it gets more humid. And sometimes we don't want humidity with grapes. Again, they don't like the humidity. So what we need is a way to keep that nice and dry in there. So this again is where canopy management comes into play. Okay, so back to macroclimate. And here we're talking about region. And this is a cross-section of the Lake Erie region. So the lake is to your left. And there's a slope that starts at Lake Erie, and it goes up to the ridge. We call it the escarpment. And at the top of the escarpment, you're on the Allegheny Plateau. And from there, it goes not too far before you get into the Allegheny Mountains and also into which are the foothills of the Appalachians. So we're, kind of transitioning between water. Lake Erie is a good-sized lake, and mountains. And so the escarpment in certain places, and we can use Pennsylvania as an example, it's about 3 miles, maybe 4 miles, depending on where you're at, from the shore of Lake Erie up to the top of the ridge. In Erie County, Pennsylvania, Interstate 90 follows the ridge, the top of the escarpment, so it creates a nice reference point for us, those of us living here, and we can say, yeah, north of 90, it's pretty warm. South of 90, they're 10 degrees cooler in the fall. And why is that? Well, look at the airflow pattern here. Lake Erie, it's a big body of water. In the summertime, it'll warm up into the 70s. And then when it gets into the fall, the lake is still warm. And so long into October, the lake is still, actually relatively warm. I've swam in the lake in October before. It was chilly, but doable. And it's giving off heat. And as the heat rises, it goes over the land, cools down, and basically you can see how it runs right off the escarpment and cascades back down over the hillside, the slope leading back to the lake. So there's constant air movement. Cold air drains away to the lake. Warm air off the lake replaces that. And so we actually, in the fall, during harvest, we can stay about 10 degrees cooler than the escarpment and further onto the Allegheny Plateau. So we might see our first frost happening sometime in November, and for the area on the other side of Interstate 90, so south of the escarpment. So, the shoreline is an east-west shoreline, lakes to the north, lands to the south. We're actually looking in this one, I would say we were looking east with the escarpment on the south side and the Lake Erie on the north. All this to say that, we can be 10 degrees warmer. They'll get a frost in September. We may not get one until, I've seen it go into December before the temperature actually drops below freezing. That gives us a much longer growing season than we normally would have. Let's reverse this, and let's look at it in the springtime. So right now, in the middle of winter, the lake is almost frozen over, which means that it's at least 32 degrees and probably a little bit colder. And it also isn't doing much in terms of slowing down the cold air coming out of Canada. So this is kind of a dangerous time. But it will keep the temperature usually above kind of the absolute minimum of like 10 below. Like very seldom do we get below that. In fact, that's even rare. We're usually at the lowest around maybe -2. 0 is kind of typical for us. When it warms up in the summertime or in the springtime, the lake still stays cool. It may get warm south of the escarpment, but the lake keeps us cool, kind of a reverse flow of what we see there. And what that does is delay bud break for us so that we don't get any vine activity until well into April. And by then, it's usually warm enough that it's not going to freeze again, and off we go into our growing season. So it keeps us, keeps everything dormant until it's good and ready to start ripening or start growing, and then gives us a longer season when it really counts. So this is how a macroclimate's created, and it actually creates the Lake Erie region. So south of the escarpment, no grapes at all. On the slopes and from the escarpment north to Lake Erie, we have some of the largest vineyards on the East Coast. So it definitely has an effect on our ability to grow grapes. Let's look at a comparable region, and that would be Germany, actually country, and several regions in there. And what I just want to point out here is if you look at this, you've got Baden, you've got the Pfalz, you've got Rheinhessen and Nahe in Mosel, the Mittelrhein, the Rheingau. In other words, all these regions growing, they're growing grapes along the Rhine River. You've got tributaries coming in, the Franken, the Mosel's a tributary. You've got some rivers over here that also support grape growing regions. The point here is that in Germany, if they grow grapes, it's probably next to a river or a body of water, because that they rely on that that ability to moderate their temperatures based on the water around it. And here's why. So this is in the Rhine region, kind of in the central part of that whole mass of the Rhine growing region. And you can see that these are vineyards in the big picture here, growing along the side. This is the top, the river's at the bottom. For perspective, right there is a car. And pretty steep hillside, and so the cold air flows off from that. What's also interesting to note, if you look in this little picture here, you can see there's one part of the river. On this side, they've got vineyards. There's some nice rock outcroppings. The village is on this side, and if you look around, this is all trees over in here as well. And so what they're really doing is where the slope is oriented toward the south, so that they pick up the sun. That's where they grow the grapes. If it's on the other side of the river and it's a north-facing slope, then it's not going to be warmed by the sun. In fact, the sun is going to be basically casting a shadow over it. Then it's too cold to grow grapes. So they not only do they rely on the river, but they optimize the sun heating by site selection along that river. So another critical important of why Germany can grow grapes where they are. They're actually quite a ways north, if you look at it on the map. And finally, let's talk about one other important aspect of grape growing, and that's rainfall. And we can identify two scenarios as, I don't want to say that this encompasses the entire realm of grape growing in the world, but it kind of plays up two important parts here. There's two scenarios. One of them is that there is ample water from the sky. In other words, it rains a lot. And this is typical of Europe and Eastern U.S., at least a lot of Europe, and a lot of the Eastern United States. And in these places, I would say vintage is more relevant. So vintage meaning the conditions in any given year that determine the quality of the grape. And it's more variable because the weather and the water, the rain, have a lot of influence on the ripening quality. And we know this around here in Pennsylvania. If we get a lot of rain, it can create a lot of rot. And things don't ripen as well. If we have lots of sun and enough water, then things ripen really well. On the flip side, we can have just the opposite, where the conditions are kind of chronically dry, but they're able to irrigate. So this would be true for California and Australia as examples. And basically what happens here is that the sunlight is not a limiting factor. They have plenty of that. The water could be a limiting factor, but they have the ability to irrigate, which means that the vineyard manager has the power to look at the vines and say, oh, they look stressed, and turn the pump on. The grapevine is watered. The vineyard manager says, my vines don't look stressed anymore, and he turns the pump off. and things dry out. So almost no disease problem. He has the ability, or she has the ability, to control exactly as much water as they need in order to grow the best quality grapes. And life's pretty good that way. And in this case, I would say that the vintage, in other words, the year and the climate, doesn't change much, and it's less relevant. So, when I hear California say, well, the vintage wasn't that good, we only got to 26 bricks instead of 27, I think, you don't know anything about vintage. Where we kind of go, we only made it to 16, and we struggled with that, or the grapes rotted off the vine, or it was just a fantastic year and we got perfect numbers. That's vintage, and that's the importance of vintage. So, one last thing. Let's look at California as kind of the flip side of Lake Erie. So Lake Erie required that the waters actually kept the harvest warm, so we had an extended growing season. In California, notice that they also have their major growing areas right along this area. It's coastal because, well, if you've ever been in the Pacific Ocean, you know it's not warm. And it keeps things cool. And even in like Napa Valley, there's the Carneros region, which is right where this cold air, or cool air, funnels off the San Francisco Bay and, keeps that particular valley cool. And so it has its own macroclimate that is distinct from other parts of Napa Valley. The Sierra foothills, we're talking about altitude here instead of proximity to water as a way to cool things down, so they go up in the hills. Central Valley is just a totally different situation. It is a huge agricultural area, and they can grow whatever they want as long as they have access to the water they need. And the quality from Central Valley is generally not as high, but the quantity and the disease-freeness of it is just absolutely incredible. So that's why that one exists there. But in terms of wine quality, probably not the best. So let's stop here, and we'll pick up again and look at just a little bit more about maybe some specifics about grape growing, trellising, pruning, training, and a little bit about canopy management, just to kind of put that in perspective for you as well.